The desert wind whipped across the tarmac at Camp Lejeune as Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her flight helmet one final time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield, where rows of military aircraft stood ready for another day of training exercises. Sarah had been stationed here for 3 years, but today felt different. Today, she would meet the new commanding officer who had been transferred from overseas operations. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez stepped out of the black SUV with the bearing of a man who had seen too much combat. His uniform was crisp despite the early hour, and his weathered face spoke of decades spent in service to his country. At 52, he commanded respect without saying a word, but behind his steely exterior lurked memories that haunted him in the quiet moments between missions. Sarah watched from a distance as the colonel surveyed the base with calculating eyes. She had heard whispers about his legendary service record, the classified missions that earned him 3 Purple Hearts and a chest full of commendations. What the other Marines didn't know was that their paths had crossed before, under circumstances that would forever bind them in ways neither could have anticipated. The briefing room filled with the usual morning chatter as pilots gathered for the daily mission assignments. Sarah took her customary seat in the 3rd row, notepad ready, coffee growing cold in her hands. She had developed a reputation as one of the most skilled helicopter pilots on the base, earning the respect of her peers through countless hours of flawless execution and unwavering dedication. Colonel Rodriguez entered the room with purposeful strides, and conversations immediately ceased. He positioned himself at the front podium, his presence commanding absolute attention from every person present. The silence stretched for several moments as he studied the faces before him, memorizing names and matching them to the service records he had reviewed the night before. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Colonel Rodriguez, your new commanding officer." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I've spent the last 15 years in active combat zones, and I expect nothing less than excellence from each of you. Your reputation precedes this unit, and I intend to maintain the high standards that have been established here." Sarah listened intently as the colonel outlined his expectations and vision for the unit. There was something familiar about his voice, a cadence that stirred memories she had tried to bury deep in her mind. She studied his profile, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow and the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, as if compensating for an old injury. The mission assignments began with routine training exercises and transport duties. Sarah's name appeared on the list for advanced tactical maneuvers, a challenging assignment that would test her skills in low-altitude flying and precision landing techniques. She had requested this type of training repeatedly, knowing it would prepare her for the special operations assignments she desperately wanted. "Captain Chen," Colonel Rodriguez's voice cut through her thoughts. "You'll be flying the lead helicopter in today's exercise. I want to observe your techniques firsthand." Sarah nodded professionally, but something in his tone made her pulse quicken. "Yes, sir. What are the parameters for today's mission?" "Simulated rescue operation in hostile territory. You'll need to navigate through a series of obstacles while maintaining radio silence, then execute a precision landing in a designated hot zone." The colonel's eyes seemed to study her reaction carefully. "Think you can handle it?" "Absolutely, sir." Sarah's confidence was genuine. She had performed similar operations dozens of times, both in training and during her deployment overseas 2 years earlier. What she couldn't shake was the feeling that this was more than a routine evaluation. As the briefing concluded, Marines began filing out of the room to prepare for their respective missions. Sarah gathered her materials and headed toward the door, but Colonel Rodriguez's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Captain Chen, a word please." She turned back to face him, maintaining the proper military bearing while fighting the growing unease in her stomach. The room had emptied except for the two of them, and the silence felt heavy with unspoken tension. "Your service record is impressive," he began, flipping through a thick file folder. "Graduated top of your class from flight school, exemplary performance reviews, and a commendation for valor during Operation Desert Shield. Tell me about your overseas deployment." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I was stationed at Forward Operating Base Alpha in Afghanistan, sir. Primary duties included medical evacuations and supply runs to remote outposts. We also provided air support for special operations when requested." Colonel Rodriguez nodded slowly, but his expression remained unreadable. "And your call sign during that deployment?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her hands clenched involuntarily at her sides as memories she had spent 2 years trying to forget came flooding back. The smell of smoke and jet fuel, the sound of gunfire echoing across desert valleys, the weight of impossible decisions made in split-second moments. "My call sign was Phantom 7, sir." The file folder slipped from Colonel Rodriguez's hands, papers scattering across the floor as his face went completely white. He gripped the edge of the podium to steady himself, and, for a moment, the composed military officer disappeared, replaced by a man confronting ghosts from his past. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Phantom 7 was lost in action. The helicopter went down in enemy territory. There were no survivors." Sarah's heart pounded as she watched the colonel struggle with emotions he was clearly trying to suppress. She had wondered if this day would ever come, if she would ever face someone who knew the truth about what happened on that terrible night in the Afghan mountains. "Sir, I think we need to discuss this in private," she said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they were still alone. Colonel Rodriguez straightened up, his military training reasserting itself despite the shock. "My office. Now." They walked in silence through the corridors of the administrative building, passing other Marines who offered respectful greetings to their commanding officer. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to prepare for a conversation she had hoped would never happen. She had built a new life, a new identity, but the past had finally caught up with her. The colonel's office was spartanly decorated, with only the essential furniture and a few framed photographs on the desk. Sarah noticed one picture showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces streaked with dirt, and my survival and subsequent reassignment were part of a covert operation that required complete secrecy. "I don't give a damn about classifications right now," the colonel's voice was strained with barely controlled emotion. "I was there that night, Captain. I was the ground commander who called for emergency extraction. I watched your helicopter take multiple hits from enemy fire before it disappeared into that canyon. I organized the search and rescue operation that found nothing but wreckage and blood." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that her presumed death had affected him far more deeply than she could have imagined. She had been so focused on her own survival and the mission requirements that she never considered how her disappearance would impact the people who had depended on her. "You have to understand, sir, the situation was more complex than it appeared. Yes, my helicopter was hit, and yes, we went down in that canyon. But what the official reports couldn't reveal was that we were carrying something more than just wounded soldiers." Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, his attention completely focused on her words. "What do you mean?" "We had a high-value intelligence asset on board, someone whose capture would have compromised ongoing operations across the entire region. When we realized the helicopter couldn't make it back to base, we made the decision to fake the crash and evacuate the asset through alternative means." The explanation was partially true, but Sarah couldn't reveal the full extent of what had happened that night. The intelligence asset had indeed been critical, but the real reason for the deception ran much deeper into black operations that even a colonel with Rodriguez's clearance level couldn't access. "So you let everyone believe you were dead? Do you have any idea what that did to the men who served under your command? To the families who were told their loved ones died in that crash?" Sarah felt the weight of his accusation like a knife to her heart. "Sir, the decision wasn't mine alone. I was following direct orders from Intelligence Command. The success of the mission required complete believability of our deaths. If anyone had known we survived, it would have compromised not just our safety, but the safety of dozens of other operatives in the field." Colonel Rodriguez stood and began pacing behind his desk, running his hands through his graying hair. "How many others survived? How many of my people are out there living under false identities while their families mourn their deaths? I can't answer that question, sir. Even now, there are aspects of that operation that remain classified beyond my clearance level." The silence stretched between them as the colonel processed this information. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the conflict between his duty as an officer to respect classification protocols and his personal need to understand what had happened to the people under his command. What I can tell you, Sarah continued carefully, is that every person involved in that operation volunteered for the assignment knowing the potential consequences. We understood that our previous lives would have to end, and we accepted that sacrifice for the greater mission. And what was this greater mission that was worth destroying so many lives? Sarah hesitated, knowing she was approaching the boundaries of what she could reveal. Intelligence gathering that prevented a major terrorist attack on American soil. The asset we extracted provided information that saved thousands of civilian lives. I can't give you more details than that. Colonel Rodriguez stopped pacing and fixed her with a penetrating stare. How do I know you're telling me the truth? How do I know you're not some enemy operative who somehow obtained classified information about a dead Marine? The question was fair, and Sarah had anticipated it. She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small metal object, a challenge coin bearing the insignia of their old unit. But this coin was different from the standard issue. It bore additional markings that only members of the Special Operations team would recognize. You gave me this coin the night before the mission, she said, placing it on his desk. You told me it had belonged to your father, who served in Vietnam. You said it would bring me luck and ensure I made it home safely. Colonel Rodriguez picked up the coin with trembling hands, turning it over to examine the familiar scratches and wear marks. His father had carried this coin through 3 tours in Southeast Asia before passing it down to his son. Rodriguez had only given it to Sarah because something about that mission felt different, more dangerous than their usual operations. This proves you're Sarah Chen, he said quietly, but it doesn't explain how you're here, or what really happened that night. What really happened is that we completed our mission, sir. The intelligence we gathered and the asset we protected led to the disruption of a terrorist network that was planning coordinated attacks on military installations across 3 countries. The official story of our deaths provided the cover necessary for follow-up operations that continued for months afterward. The colonel sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of this revelation settling over him like a physical burden. For 2 years, he had carried guilt about the mission that went wrong under his command. He had replayed every decision, questioned every order he had given, wondering if he could have done something different to bring his people home safely. I've been living with the guilt of losing you and your crew for 2 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I recommended your family for the highest military honors. I attended memorial services for people who were still alive. How am I supposed to process this information? Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Sir, I know this is difficult to understand, but you have to believe that none of us wanted to cause that kind of pain. The decision to maintain our cover identities wasn't made lightly. There were people whose lives depended on the world believing we were dead. And now? Why are you here now, using your real name and serving openly? The operation concluded 6 months ago. All the targets were neutralized, and the intelligence networks were dismantled. My handlers determined it was safe for me to resume service under my real identity, but with a new assignment that would keep me away from anyone who might recognize me from the old unit. Except they didn't count on me being transferred here. No sir, they didn't. My presence here puts both of us in a difficult position. Colonel Rodriguez stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling activity of the Marine base. Young men and women went about their duties with the confidence that came from serving in an organization built on honor, courage, and commitment. The revelation that one of their number had been living a lie for 2 years challenged everything he believed about military integrity. What happens now, Captain? Do I report this to my superiors? Do I pretend this conversation never happened? Do I have you transferred to another unit to maintain your cover? Sarah had been dreading this moment since she learned of his assignment to the base. Sir, that decision is above both of our pay grades. What I can tell you is that there are protocols in place for this type of situation. If you feel you need to report this up the chain of command, I understand. But I hope you'll consider the broader implications before you make that decision. What broader implications? There are other operations, other assets still in play around the world. If word gets out that the Phantom 7 mission was a deception, it could compromise ongoing intelligence gathering efforts and put American lives at risk. The colonel turned back to face her, his expression grim. So I'm supposed to keep this secret? Pretend that I don't know one of my officers is supposed to be dead? Sir, I'm asking you to consider the oath we both took when we accepted our commissions. Sometimes serving our country requires us to carry burdens that we can't share with anyone else. Sometimes the greater good requires personal sacrifice that goes beyond what we ever imagined when we signed up. Colonel Rodriguez returned to his desk and sat down, picking up the challenge coin once more. The metal was warm from his handling, and he could feel the familiar weight that had brought him comfort during his own dark moments overseas. I need time to process this, Captain. For now, you'll continue your duties as assigned. We'll proceed with today's training exercise as planned, and you'll perform to the best of your abilities. But understand that this conversation is far from over. Yes, sir, I understand. One more thing, Chen. If I find out you've lied to me about any part of this story, if I discover there's more to this deception than you're telling me, there will be consequences that go far beyond military discipline. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear, sir. Sarah stood and saluted, then turned to leave the office. As she reached for the door handle, the colonel's voice stopped her one final time. Sarah, he said, using her first name for the first time since her return from the dead. I'm glad you're alive. Whatever else this means, whatever complications it creates, I'm glad you made it home. She turned back to look at him, seeing not the stern commanding officer but the man who had carried the guilt of her presumed death for 2 long years. Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you'll ever know. As Sarah left the office and made her way toward the flight line, she knew that her carefully constructed new life was about to become infinitely more complicated. The past had caught up with her in the form of a man who had never stopped mourning the loss of his people, and now she would have to find a way to serve under his command while maintaining the secrets that had kept her alive. The helicopter awaited her on the tarmac, its rotors gleaming in the morning sun. Soon she would be airborne again, doing what she loved most, but the conversation with Colonel Rodriguez had changed everything. For the first time since her return to active duty, Sarah Chen wondered if the price of her survival had been worth the cost of the deception that made it possible. The helicopter blades cut through the air with mechanical precision as Sarah executed a series of complex maneuvers over the training range. Below, Colonel Rodriguez watched through high-powered binoculars, his mind still reeling from their morning conversation. Every movement of the aircraft seemed to confirm what he already knew but couldn't fully accept this was indeed the same pilot he had believed dead for 2 years. Sarah's flying was flawless, just as it had been during their missions in Afghanistan. She navigated the obstacle course with the same intuitive understanding of her aircraft that had made her legendary among the special operations community. The helicopter moved like an extension of her own body, responding to her commands with a grace that few pilots ever achieved. Through her headset, Sarah could hear the voices of the ground crew providing updates on her performance. Everything was proceeding according to the training scenario, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation in the colonel's office. She had spent 2 years building a new identity, convincing herself that the woman who flew under the call sign Phantom 7 had died in that canyon along with her official military record. The training exercise called for a simulated rescue in hostile territory. Sarah guided her helicopter toward the designated landing zone, a small clearing surrounded by dense vegetation that would provide cover from enemy observation. As she approached, memories of actual combat rescues flooded back with startling clarity. The smell of cordite and burning fuel, the urgent voices of wounded soldiers calling for extraction, the constant threat of enemy fire that could end everything in an instant. Phantom 7, you are clear for landing, the voice of the air traffic controller crackled through her headset. The use of her old call sign sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She glanced at her flight manifest and realized that someone had updated her designation for this mission. Colonel Rodriguez had authorized the change, perhaps as a test of her reaction or maybe as a way of processing his own conflicted emotions about her resurrection. Roger, coming in for landing, Sarah responded, pushing aside her personal feelings to focus on the mission at hand. The helicopter touched down with barely a whisper, its landing gear settling gently onto the uneven ground. Sarah maintained position while the simulated casualties were loaded aboard, her crew working with the efficiency that came from countless hours of practice. But, even as she concentrated on the technical aspects of the exercise, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her with more than professional interest. Colonel Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and turned to the training supervisor beside him. "What's your assessment of Captain Chen's performance?" "Outstanding as always, sir. She's consistently rated as one of our best pilots for precision operations. Her landing technique is textbook perfect, and her crew coordination is exceptional." The colonel nodded, but his thoughts were far from the current training exercise. He was remembering another mission, another landing zone, where the stakes had been real and the margin for error non-existent. Phantom 7 had extracted his wounded soldiers from an ambush that should have killed them all, flying through enemy fire with the same calm precision she was displaying now. "Sir, is everything all right?" the training supervisor asked, noticing the colonel's distant expression. "Fine, Lieutenant. Continue monitoring the exercise." Rodriguez walked away from the observation post, needing space to think about the implications of Sarah's return. As a commanding officer, he had clear protocols to follow when faced with irregularities in personnel files or questions about a subordinate's identity. But this situation fell outside any scenario covered in military regulations. Back in the helicopter, Sarah completed the rescue simulation and began the return flight to base. The familiar rhythm of rotor blades and engine noise usually brought her peace, but today it only amplified her anxiety about the future. She had hoped that resuming her real identity would provide closure to the difficult chapter of her life, but encountering someone from her past had opened wounds she thought had healed. "Phantom 7, this is base control. You are cleared for approach to landing pad Alpha." "Roger, base control. Beginning final approach." As the base came into view, Sarah noticed increased activity around the administrative buildings. Several official vehicles were parked near the headquarters, and personnel were moving with the urgency that typically accompanied unscheduled inspections or visits from higher command. The helicopter settled onto the landing pad with its usual gentle precision, and Sarah began the post-flight shutdown procedures. Her crew moved efficiently to secure the aircraft and complete their equipment checks, but she could sense tension in their movements that hadn't been there during the morning briefing. "Captain Chen, report to Colonel Rodriguez's office immediately upon completion of your post-flight duties," the voice of the base operations officer came through the radio. Sarah's stomach tightened as she acknowledged the order. The formal tone suggested this wasn't a routine debriefing, and the timing coincided too closely with the arrival of the official vehicles to be coincidental. She wondered if the colonel had already made the decision to report her situation to his superiors. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood outside the colonel's office, her uniform properly adjusted and her military bearing firmly in place. Through the closed door, she could hear multiple voices engaged in serious conversation. She recognized Colonel Rodriguez's voice, but there were at least two others she didn't recognize. The door opened before she could knock, and a man in civilian clothing emerged. He was middle-aged with the kind of unremarkable appearance that suggested intelligence work, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone accustomed to dealing with classified information. Behind him came another man in military uniform bearing the insignia of a full general. "Captain Chen, Colonel Rodriguez called from inside the office. Please come in and close the door behind you." Sarah entered the office to find it transformed from the sparse military workspace she had visited that morning. Documents were spread across every available surface, and a secure communications terminal had been set up on a side table. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the weight of serious decision-making. "Captain, I'd like you to meet General Harrison from Marine Corps Intelligence and Mr. Davidson from the Defense Intelligence Agency," Colonel Rodriguez said formally. "They're here to discuss your situation." General Harrison was a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades managing complex military operations. His uniform displayed ribbons indicating service in multiple combat zones, and his direct gaze suggested he was not someone easily deceived or manipulated. "Captain Chen," the general began, or should I say, Captain Sarah Chen, formerly known as Phantom 7, officially killed in action during Operation Desert Shield, currently serving under her real name despite being listed as deceased in official military records? "Sir, I prefer to stick with Captain Chen, if that's acceptable." Mr. Davidson stepped forward, consulting a thick folder filled with documents. "Captain, we're here because your reappearance has created a significant administrative and security challenge. Your official death was used as cover for a highly classified operation that, according to our records, concluded 6 months ago. Yet you're here, serving openly, without proper authorization for your resurrection." Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with being the subject of intelligence scrutiny. "Sir, I was told my cover identity was no longer necessary and that I could resume service under my real name. I followed the orders I was given." "That's the problem, Captain," General Harrison interjected. "There's no record of any such authorization in our files. The operation you were involved in officially never existed, which means there's no official mechanism for bringing you back from the dead." The implications of this statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent 2 years living under an assumed identity, believing she was serving her country in a necessary deception. Now it seemed that deception had taken on a life of its own, creating bureaucratic complications that threatened her very existence as a military officer. Colonel Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Gentlemen, Captain Chen has been serving with distinction at this base for several months. Her performance has been exemplary, and she's earned the respect of her fellow Marines. Surely there must be a way to resolve this situation without destroying her career." Mr. Davidson exchanged a look with General Harrison before responding. "Colonel, the issue isn't Captain Chen's current performance. The problem is that her continued existence creates potential security breaches in multiple ongoing operations. There are people around the world who believe she's dead, and that belief is crucial to maintaining certain intelligence networks." "What exactly are you saying?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "We're saying that Captain Sarah Chen needs to disappear again," General Harrison replied bluntly. "The question is whether the disappearance will be voluntary or involuntary, temporary or permanent." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Sarah realized she had walked into a situation far more complex than she had imagined. The intelligence operation that had supposedly ended was apparently still active, and her presence in the open was threatening its security. "Sir, with respect, I've served my country faithfully for 8 years. I've followed every order, completed every mission, and sacrificed more than most people could imagine. I've earned the right to exist under my own name and serve openly as a United States Marine." Mr. Davidson consulted his files again. "Captain, according to our records, you volunteered for an operation that required the complete abandonment of your previous identity. That wasn't a temporary assignment, it was a permanent transformation. The fact that you've resumed your original identity without authorization constitutes a breach of your operational security oath." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The mission briefing she remembered had indeed mentioned the possibility of permanent identity change, but she had believed it was a worst-case scenario. Now it seemed that permanent disappearance had been the plan from the beginning. "General, there has to be another solution," Colonel Rodriguez interjected. "Captain Chen is too valuable an asset to simply make disappear. Her skills and experience are exactly what we need for our special operations program." "Colonel, I appreciate your loyalty to your people, but this decision involves considerations beyond your unit's immediate needs," General Harrison replied. "There are implications for national security that supersede individual concerns." Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at General Harrison. "Sir, I request permission to speak freely." "Granted." "I've spent 2 years living a lie, believing I was serving a greater purpose by sacrificing my identity and my relationships with family and friends. I've watched my parents mourn my death while I was forbidden from contacting them. I've missed my sister's wedding and my grandfather's funeral because the world had to believe I was dead." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I accepted all of that because I believed it was temporary and necessary. But if the true intention was to make me disappear forever, then I was deceived about the nature of my service. I have rights as an American citizen and as a United States Marine, and I'm prepared to exercise those rights if necessary." Mr. Davidson closed his folder and looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Captain, what rights do you think you have when your official existence was terminated 2 years ago? Sarah Chen died in Afghanistan. There's a grave marker with your name on it in Arlington National Cemetery. Your death benefits have been paid to your family. From a legal standpoint, you're a ghost. The brutal reality of her situation crystallized in Sarah's mind. She had been so focused on the operational aspects of her mission that she had never fully considered the administrative and legal implications of her presumed death. Now she was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare where her very existence was considered a security breach. Colonel Rodriguez stood up from his desk, his frustration evident. This is unacceptable. You can't just make people disappear because it's administratively convenient. Captain Chen has served with honor, and she deserves better than to be treated as a loose end that needs to be tied up. Colonel, your emotional attachment to this situation is understandable but inappropriate, General Harrison responded coldly. You've been briefed on the security implications, and you understand the necessity of maintaining operational security. Sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Sarah realized that arguing about rights and fairness was futile. These men operated in a world where individuals were expendable assets to be managed according to strategic objectives. If she was going to survive this encounter, she needed to demonstrate her value in terms they would understand. Gentlemen, before you make any final decisions about my fate, I think you should consider what I learned during my 2 years undercover, she said, her voice taking on a more confident tone. Mr. Davidson reopened his folder, suddenly interested. What kind of information? The intelligence network I was investigating didn't end when the official operation concluded. I discovered evidence of a new cell that's been operating independently, using resources and contacts from the original network. They're planning something significant, but I need more time to develop my sources and gather actionable intelligence. General Harrison leaned forward in his chair. Why wasn't this information included in your final operational report? Because I only discovered it after the official operation ended. When I was told to resume my real identity, I thought my intelligence gathering days were over. But the contacts I had developed continued to reach out to me, thinking I was still operating undercover. Sarah was improvising now, building on fragments of real intelligence she had gathered to create a plausible scenario that might buy her time. She knew it was a desperate gambit, but it was the only card she had left to play. What kind of operation are they planning? Mr. Davidson asked. I'm not certain yet, but the communications I've intercepted suggest a coordinated attack on military installations, possibly timed to coincide with a major political event. The planning is more sophisticated than anything we've seen from this network before, which suggests they've received significant external support. The three men exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in their minds. If her information was accurate, it represented exactly the kind of threat that justified maintaining her operational status rather than eliminating a security risk. Captain, if what you're saying is true, then your continued existence as Sarah Chen may indeed be strategically valuable, General Harrison said slowly. But we would need concrete evidence of this new threat before we could consider altering our assessment of your situation. How much time would I have to provide that evidence? Mr. Davidson consulted his watch. Given the sensitive nature of this situation, I'd say you have 72 hours to produce actionable intelligence that justifies your continued existence in your current identity. The ultimatum was clear: prove your value or disappear forever. Sarah nodded, accepting the terms while her mind raced to figure out how she could possibly deliver on her improvised promises. I'll need access to my previous operational assets and communication channels, she said. Denied, Mr. Davidson replied immediately. If you truly have new intelligence, you'll need to gather it using only the resources available to you in your current assignment. We can't risk exposing ongoing operations or compromising other assets. Sarah felt the trap closing around her, but she maintained her composure. Understood. I'll work with what I have available. General Harrison stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Captain, I want to be clear about the stakes here. If you fail to produce credible intelligence within the specified timeframe, or if we determine that you've fabricated information to buy yourself time, the consequences will be severe and permanent. Do you understand? Yes, sir, I understand completely. Colonel Rodriguez, you will provide Captain Chen with whatever administrative support she requires, but you are not to discuss the details of this conversation with anyone else on the base. This situation is classified at the highest levels." "Understood, General." As the intelligence officials gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Sarah stood at attention, waiting for dismissal. Her mind was already working on the problem of how to manufacture credible intelligence about a threat that she had largely invented. "One more thing, Captain," Mr. Davidson said as he reached the door. "Don't think about running. There's nowhere you can go that we won't find you, and attempting to flee would only confirm our suspicions about your reliability." After the door closed behind them, Sarah and Colonel Rodriguez stood in silence for several moments. The weight of what had just transpired settled over them like a heavy blanket, and both realized that their lives had become infinitely more complicated in the span of a single conversation. "Sarah, what the hell have you gotten yourself into?" the colonel asked quietly. "I wish I knew, sir. I thought I was following orders and serving my country. Now it seems I've become a liability that needs to be managed." Colonel Rodriguez walked to his window and looked out at the base where Marines continued their daily routines, unaware of the drama playing out in the administrative offices. "Is any of what you told them true? Do you really have intelligence about a new threat?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "Some of it is true, sir. There were loose ends from the original operation that never got fully resolved. But the specific threat I described, that was mostly creative improvisation designed to buy me time. So you've got 72 hours to either find real intelligence or create something convincing enough to fool some very smart people who are already suspicious of you. That's about the size of it, sir." The colonel turned back to face her, his expression grim but determined. "Then, we'd better get to work. Because if we can't figure this out, I'm going to lose the best pilot I've ever commanded, and you're going to lose a lot more than that." Sarah nodded, grateful for his support but terrified by the magnitude of the challenge ahead of her. She had 72 hours to justify her existence, and failure was not an option she could afford to contemplate. The clock on Colonel Rodriguez's wall showed 11:37 p.m. as Sarah hunched over a secure computer terminal, her eyes burning from hours of screen time. She had spent the entire day combing through classified databases, looking for any thread she could pull that might lead to actionable intelligence. The deadline was approaching rapidly, and she was no closer to proving her worth than she had been that morning. Across the office, Colonel Rodriguez poured his fourth cup of coffee and settled back into his chair. He had cancelled all his appointments for the day, officially citing administrative reviews, but in reality dedicating himself to helping Sarah find a way out of her impossible situation. The guilt he felt about her presumed death had transformed into determination to keep her alive, both literally and figuratively. "Anything promising in the communication intercepts?" he asked, rubbing his tired eyes. Sarah scrolled through another batch of encrypted messages that had been flagged by automated monitoring systems. Most were routine chatter between known low-level operatives, but something in the pattern of recent communications had caught her attention. "There's definitely increased activity in the networks we were monitoring during the original operation," she replied. "The message frequency has tripled in the past 6 weeks, and they're using code phrases that weren't in their vocabulary before the supposed network shutdown. Could be coincidental. These groups adapt their communication methods constantly to avoid detection. Maybe, but look at this." Sarah highlighted a series of messages on her screen. These all reference something called Desert Flower with delivery dates that correspond to major military exercises scheduled for next month. It could be innocent, but the timing is suspicious. Colonel Rodriguez moved to look over her shoulder at the screen. "Desert Flower doesn't appear in any of the previous operational files?" "No, and that's what makes it interesting. It's either a completely new operation, or it's a code name that was developed after the official network was disbanded. Either way, it suggests ongoing activity that wasn't captured in the original intelligence assessment." Sarah's excitement was growing as she saw the potential in this lead. It wasn't the smoking gun that would definitively prove her claims, but it was a starting point that could be developed into something more substantial with additional investigation. The challenge is that I need more than suspicious communications to satisfy General Harrison and Mr. Davidson. They want actionable intelligence that proves an imminent threat, not just evidence of possible criminal activity. Colonel Rodriguez returned to his desk and opened his own computer terminal. What if we approach this from a different angle? Instead of trying to prove the threat exists, what if we position you as the best asset to investigate whether it exists? I'm not following. Think about it strategically. You have established cover identities and operational experience that would take months to recreate with another operative. Even if the threat you described turns out to be minimal, the investigation itself has value. You become an investment in intelligence gathering rather than a liability to be eliminated. Sarah considered this perspective, recognizing the wisdom in reframing her situation. Instead of being a problem that needed to be solved, she could position herself as a solution to a problem that might exist. That could work, but I'd need to demonstrate enough credible intelligence to justify the investment. And I'd need to show that my unique background makes me irreplaceable for this type of operation. Let's start with what you know about the original network. Who were the key players, and which ones might still be active despite the official shutdown? Sarah pulled up a different database and began cross-referencing names and locations from her previous mission. The original network had been extensive, spanning multiple countries and involving dozens of individuals at various levels of the organization. While the primary leadership had been captured or eliminated, many of the lower-level operatives had simply disappeared when the network collapsed. Here's something interesting, she said, pointing to a personnel file. Ahmad Nazir, who was a mid-level coordinator in the original network. He was never captured, and his current whereabouts are unknown. But, look at this, there's been recent financial activity in accounts associated with his known aliases. Colonel Rodriguez studied the financial records that Sarah had pulled up. The amounts are significant, and the timing coincides with the increased communications you identified earlier. Could be our connection. There's more. Nazir had contacts throughout the Middle East and North Africa, including some who operated independently of the main network. If he's reorganizing with new resources, he could be coordinating with cells that we never identified during the original operation. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed additional databases, following digital breadcrumbs that were starting to form a pattern. The more she dug, the more convinced she became that something significant was indeed happening in the remnants of the network she had helped dismantle. Colonel, I think we might actually have something here. Look at this travel pattern. She displayed a map showing movement of known associates across several countries. These people haven't communicated directly in over a year, but they've all been traveling to the same general region in the past month. Where? Morocco. Specifically, the border region near Algeria. It's remote enough to avoid casual observation, but accessible enough to serve as a staging area for operations elsewhere. Colonel Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. If you're right about this, then your 72-hour deadline might actually work in our favor. We present this as preliminary intelligence that requires immediate follow-up investigation, with you as the primary asset. The question is whether General Harrison and Mr. Davidson will buy it. They're not going to take my word for this analysis, especially given the circumstances of how it was developed. Then, we don't rely on your word alone. We bring in additional verification from other sources. Sarah looked at him questioningly. What other sources? Colonel Rodriguez smiled for the first time since their ordeal had begun. You're not the only person on this base with intelligence experience, Captain. I've got contacts throughout the military intelligence community, people who owe me favors from previous operations. If we can corroborate your findings through independent sources, it becomes much harder to dismiss as fabricated evidence. For the next 2 hours, Colonel Rodriguez worked his network of contacts, making discreet inquiries about recent activity in the regions and networks that Sarah had identified. The responses were gradual but consistent. Multiple sources confirmed unusual patterns of movement and communication that aligned with Sarah's analysis. This is looking more credible by the minute, he said after ending a secure call with a contact at the Defense Intelligence Agency. My sources are seeing the same patterns you identified, but from different collection methods. That's exactly the kind of corroboration we need. Sarah felt a surge of hope for the first time since their meeting with the intelligence officials. Do you think it will be enough to convince them? Maybe. But we need one more element to make this bulletproof. We need to demonstrate that you specifically are the key to developing this intelligence further. How do we do that? Colonel Rodriguez consulted his notes from the various conversations he'd had throughout the day. Your previous operational cover identities are still intact, right? The people you were monitoring don't know that Sarah Chin is supposed to be dead? That's correct. As far as they know, I'm still operating under my cover identity, just maintaining a lower profile since the network shutdown. Then, that's our ace in the hole. You're not just another intelligence analyst looking at this situation from the outside, you're someone who already has established relationships with the people involved. You can develop human intelligence that would take other operatives months to cultivate. Sarah began to see the strategy taking shape. So we present this as an ongoing operation that I'm uniquely qualified to continue, rather than a new investigation that I've stumbled across. Exactly. You become the continuity between the old operation and the new threat, rather than a liability that needs to be managed. They spent the remaining hours before dawn refining their presentation, organizing the intelligence they had gathered into a compelling narrative that positioned Sarah as an essential asset rather than a security risk. By the time the sun began to rise over the base, they had constructed a case that was both credible and strategically valuable. At exactly 8 a.m., Sarah stood outside the conference room where General Harrison and Mr. Davidson were waiting for her report. She carried a thick folder containing the intelligence analysis she and Colonel Rodriguez had developed, along with supporting documentation from multiple independent sources. Captain Chen, I trust you've had a productive 72 hours? General Harrison said as she entered the room. Yes, sir, very productive. I believe I've identified a significant threat that requires immediate attention. Sarah opened her folder and began presenting the intelligence they had gathered, walking the officials through the pattern of communications, financial transactions, and personnel movements that suggested a reconstituted network. She was careful to present the information objectively, allowing the evidence to speak for itself rather than overselling her conclusions. These communication patterns suggest coordination between cells that were previously thought to be defunct, she explained, displaying the intercepts they had analyzed. The financial activity indicates significant new funding sources, and the travel patterns suggest a possible staging area in North Africa. Mr. Davidson studied the documents carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about sources and methods. His background in intelligence work made him naturally skeptical, but Sarah could see that he was taking the analysis seriously. This is interesting work, Captain, but it's largely circumstantial. Do you have any direct evidence of operational planning or specific targets? Sarah had anticipated this question and was prepared with her response. Not yet, sir, but I believe I can develop that intelligence using my existing operational cover. The key figures in this network still consider me an active asset, which gives me unique access to their planning discussions. That would require you to resume your cover identity and potentially return to the field, General Harrison observed. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? Yes, sir, absolutely. This network poses a genuine threat to American interests, and I have the best opportunity to infiltrate and disrupt their operations before they can execute whatever they're planning. The two officials exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them weighing the value of her intelligence against the complications of her continued existence. She held her breath, knowing that her life hung in the balance of their decision. Captain, your analysis is thorough and your recommendations are sound, Mr. Davidson said finally. But there's still the matter of your unauthorized resumption of your real identity. That represents a significant breach of operational security that can't be overlooked. Sarah's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. Sir, I understand the security concerns, but I would argue that my current position actually enhances my operational value. Having an official military assignment provides perfect cover for my intelligence activities. How so? Military personnel are expected to travel, communicate internationally, and have access to sensitive facilities. My role as a Marine pilot gives me legitimate reasons to be in locations where intelligence operatives might seem suspicious. It's the perfect cover identity because it's completely genuine. General Harrison nodded slowly, apparently considering this perspective. You're suggesting that Saracen the Marine pilot becomes the cover identity for Saracen the intelligence operative? Exactly, sir. Instead of creating an artificial cover that could be blown, I use my real identity and legitimate military assignment as protection for my intelligence work. The logic was sound, and Sarah could see that both officials were beginning to appreciate the elegance of the solution. Instead of being a liability, her dual existence could become a strategic advantage that provided unprecedented operational flexibility. There would need to be strict compartmentalization, Mr. Davidson said. Your commanding officer would need to be read into the operation, but your colleagues and the rest of the base personnel would need to remain unaware of your secondary mission. Colonel Rodriguez has already demonstrated his ability to maintain operational security, Sarah replied. He's been invaluable in developing the intelligence I've presented today. General Harrison consulted his notes before making his decision. Very well, Captain. We're prepared to authorize your continuation in your current assignment, with additional duties as a deep cover intelligence operative. You'll report through separate chains of command for your two roles, and you'll maintain strict separation between your military and intelligence activities. Relief flooded through Sarah's body, but she kept her expression professional. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this decision. I hope not, Captain. Because if this operation fails, or if your dual identity becomes compromised, the consequences will be severe for everyone involved. Mr. Davidson handed her a secure communication device. Your intelligence handler will contact you through this channel within the next 24 hours. Until then, you'll continue your normal military duties while we establish the operational framework for your new assignment. As the officials gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Sarah realized that her life had taken another dramatic turn. She was no longer just a Marine pilot trying to resume a normal career, she was now a deep cover operative with responsibilities that stretched far beyond her military assignment. One final question, Captain, General Harrison said as he reached the door. In your professional assessment, how serious is the threat posed by this reconstituted network? Sarah considered her response carefully, knowing that her answer would influence how aggressively the intelligence community pursued the investigation. Sir, based on the evidence I've seen, I believe we're looking at a sophisticated operation with significant resources and international reach. If they're successful in whatever they're planning, the consequences could be catastrophic. Then, I suggest you work quickly to develop more detailed intelligence. Time may not be on our side. After the officials left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, processing everything that had happened. She had managed to save her life and her career, but the price was a return to the dangerous world of intelligence operations that she had hoped to leave behind. Colonel Rodriguez entered the room a few minutes later, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. How did it go? Better than I had hoped, but more complicated than I wanted, Sarah replied. I'm staying, but I'm also going back undercover. It seems I can't escape my past after all. Are you ready for that? Going back to living a double life? Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where she had hoped to build a simple, honest career as a military pilot. I don't think anyone is ever ready for this kind of life, Colonel. But it seems to be the life I'm meant to live. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. The alternative would have been much worse. I know. And I'm grateful for your help. I couldn't have done this without you. Colonel Rodriguez smiled grimly. Just try to stay alive this time, Captain. I don't want to have to mourn your death twice. As Sarah prepared to leave the conference room and return to her duties, she knew that her life had become infinitely more complex once again. She was Saracen the Marine pilot and Saracen the intelligence operative, living parallel lives that could never fully intersect. It was a burden she would carry alone, knowing that the price of protecting others was sacrificing her own chance at a normal life. But, as she looked out at the young Marines training on the base, she knew it was a sacrifice worth making. If the threat she had identified was real, then, her unique position might be the key to preventing something terrible from happening. She had already lost so much to serve her country, what was a little more sacrifice in the cause of keeping others safe? 6 months after her fateful encounter with Colonel Rodriguez, Sarah stood on the observation deck of a cargo ship in the Mediterranean Sea, watching the sun set over waters that held secrets darker than their depths. The secure communication device in her jacket pocket buzzed with an encrypted message that would change everything once again. The mission in Morocco had exceeded everyone's expectations. Sarah's unique position as both a legitimate military officer and a deep-cover operative had allowed her to infiltrate the reconstituted network with unprecedented access. She had spent weeks posing as a pilot available for hire, gradually earning the trust of Ahmad Nazir and his associates while feeding intelligence back to her handlers. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks earlier when Nazir had revealed the true scope of their operation. Desert Flower wasn't just a single attack, it was a coordinated series of strikes designed to cripple military installations across 3 continents. The intelligence Sarah gathered had prevented attacks on American bases in Germany, Japan, and the Philippines, saving countless lives and preserving critical strategic assets. But success in the intelligence world often came with unexpected complications, and Sarah was about to discover that her victory had created new challenges that threatened everything she had worked to build. The message on her secure device was brief but ominous: immediate extraction required. Cover compromised. Proceed to emergency rendezvous point Alpha. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the words. After months of careful operational security, something had gone wrong. She destroyed the message according to protocol and began the mental checklist of emergency procedures that had been drilled into her during training years earlier. The cargo ship was 3 hours from the port of Valencia, where she was supposed to conclude her mission and return to her official duties at Camp Lejeune. Instead, she would need to disappear once again, this time with no guarantee that she would ever be able to resume her identity as Captain Sarah Chen. Moving through the ship with casual purpose, Sarah made her way to her cabin and began the process of destroying any evidence that could link her to her operational activities. Personal items that couldn't be explained were secured in a waterproof container that would go overboard before they reached port. Documents and electronic devices were wiped clean using techniques that would make recovery impossible even with advanced forensic tools. As she worked, Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities of how her cover could have been blown. She had been meticulous in maintaining her operational security, never breaking character even during private moments. The most likely explanation was that someone within the network had discovered her true identity through sources outside her immediate operational environment. The secure communication device buzzed again with coordinates for the emergency rendezvous. Sarah memorized the location and, then, destroyed the device, scattering the components throughout different disposal systems on the ship. By the time anyone thought to look for evidence of her intelligence activities, there would be nothing left to find. 2 hours later, Sarah stood on the dock in Valencia, her appearance subtly altered through techniques that made her look like a completely different person. Hair color changed with temporary dye, facial features modified with careful makeup application, and body language adjusted to project a different personality entirely. She had become Maria Santos, a Spanish businesswoman traveling on legitimate commercial purposes. The taxi ride to the emergency rendezvous point took 40 minutes through the winding streets of Valencia's old city. Sarah watched carefully for any signs of surveillance, but saw nothing that suggested immediate danger. Whatever had compromised her mission, it hadn't yet extended to active pursuit by hostile forces. The rendezvous point was a small cafe near the cathedral, chosen for its multiple exit routes and natural cover provided by tourist crowds. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early and positioned herself at a table where she could observe the entire area while maintaining easy access to emergency exits. At exactly the appointed time, a woman in her 30s approached Sarah's table. She was unremarkable in appearance, which immediately identified her as a professional intelligence operative. Her approach was casual but confident, suggesting years of experience in this type of work. Maria Santos, the woman asked in accented English. Yes, and you are? Elena Rodriguez. I believe we have mutual friends who are concerned about your travel plans. The code phrases were correct, confirming that this was indeed Sarah's extraction handler. Elena sat down across from her and ordered coffee in fluent Spanish, maintaining the appearance of a casual business meeting. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked quietly. "Ahmad Nazir is dead. Killed 3 days ago along with most of his immediate circle. Someone found out about the intelligence leak and decided to eliminate the entire network rather than risk further exposure." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Any indication that they know who the leak was?" "That's the problem. Nazir was tortured before he was killed. We have to assume he gave up everything he knew about his operational security breach." The implications were stark and terrifying. If Nazir had revealed Sarah's true identity before he died, then hostile forces now knew that a United States Marine Corps officer had been operating undercover within their network. The repercussions could extend far beyond Sarah's personal safety to compromise other operations and endanger other operatives. "What are my options?" Sarah asked. Elena consulted her smartphone, apparently checking messages but actually accessing encrypted files that contained Sarah's extraction plan. Option 1 is immediate exfiltration to a secure location outside European Union territory, followed by complete identity reconstruction. You would never return to your military career, and Sarah Chen would officially disappear permanently. Sarah had expected this possibility, but hearing it stated so bluntly still hit her like a physical blow. And option 2? Option 2 is considerably more dangerous. We insert you back into your military assignment and use your official position to help identify and neutralize any hostile forces that might be seeking revenge for their network's destruction. You become the bait in a trap designed to catch the people who killed Nazir. The choice was impossible but inevitable. Sarah had spent too many years serving her country to simply disappear when things became dangerous. Despite the risks, she knew that her duty required her to see this mission through to its conclusion. How much support would I have if I choose option 2? Full surveillance and protection teams, but operating at a distance to maintain your credibility as a target. We would need to make it appear that you're vulnerable while actually maintaining layers of security that would activate if you were threatened. Sarah considered the plan, recognizing both its strategic value and its enormous personal risk. What's the timeline? Immediate. If we're going to make this work, you need to return to your base tomorrow and resume normal duties. Any delay would seem suspicious and reduce the effectiveness of the operation. The waiter brought Elena's coffee, providing a brief interruption that allowed Sarah to process the magnitude of the decision she was being asked to make. She was being offered the chance to serve as live bait for some of the most dangerous people in the world, with only the promise of distant protection and the hope that intelligence analysts had correctly assessed the threat level. "There's something else you need to know," Elena continued after the waiter left. "Colonel Rodriguez has been briefed on the situation. He's volunteered to serve as your primary contact and coordination point for the operation." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the man who had already risked so much to help her navigate the complexities of her dual existence. He knows what he's signing up for? He insisted on being read into the operation after learning about the threat level. He said something about not wanting to lose you twice. Despite the gravity of the situation, Sarah couldn't suppress a small smile. Colonel Rodriguez had become more than just her commanding officer, he was the one person in the world who understood the full complexity of her situation and had chosen to stand by her regardless of the personal cost. "I'll take option 2, Sarah said firmly. "But I want guarantees about protection for Colonel Rodriguez and the other personnel at the base. If hostile forces come after me, I don't want innocent people caught in the crossfire." "Agreed. We'll have additional security measures in place, but concealed so as not to alert potential threats that we're expecting them." Elena finished her coffee and prepared to leave, but first she handed Sarah a small package containing documents and identification that would allow her to travel back to the United States without detection. "Your flight leaves in 4 hours. By tomorrow evening, you'll be back at Camp Lejeune, officially returning from a routine training exercise that explains your absence." As Elena walked away, Sarah remained at the cafe for several more minutes, watching the normal life of the city continue around her. Families strolled through the plaza, couples shared intimate conversations over dinner, and children played in the fountains without any awareness of the dangerous games being played in the shadows of their peaceful world. Sarah realized that this was what she was really fighting to protect: the ability of ordinary people to live ordinary lives without fear of violence or terrorism. Her sacrifices, her dual identities, and now her willingness to serve as bait for dangerous enemies were all in service of preserving the normalcy that she herself could never fully enjoy. The flight back to the United States was uneventful, but Sarah spent the entire journey analyzing every passenger and crew member for potential threats. Her training had taught her to assume that hostile forces could appear anywhere, at any time, and her current situation made her hyper-vigilant about potential dangers. Colonel Rodriguez was waiting for her when she arrived at Camp Lejeune, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes reflecting the concern he felt about the operation they were about to undertake together. They drove back to the base in silence, both understanding that their conversation would need to wait until they were in a secure environment. "Welcome back, Captain," he said once they were safely in his office with the privacy systems activated. "How was your training exercise?" "Educational, sir. I learned a great deal about the challenges of operating in uncertain environments." "I'm sure you did. I trust you're ready to apply those lessons to our upcoming operational requirements?" Sarah understood that they were speaking in code, maintaining the fiction that her absence had been a routine military activity rather than a complex intelligence operation. "Yes, sir. I'm prepared for whatever challenges we might face." Colonel Rodriguez opened a secure file on his computer and turned the screen so Sarah could see the intelligence briefing he had received about the threats they were expecting. "We're anticipating some unusual activity in the coming weeks. Nothing that should interfere with normal operations, but we want to be prepared for contingencies." The briefing contained detailed threat assessments and security protocols that would govern their daily activities for the foreseeable future. Sarah realized that her return to Camp Lejeune would be anything but routine. Every day would bring the possibility that hostile forces might attempt to exact revenge for the destruction of their network. "Sir, I want you to know that I appreciate your willingness to support this operation, despite the personal risks involved. Captain, when I took command of this unit, I accepted responsibility for the welfare of every person under my command. That includes making sure that someone who has served her country with such distinction gets the support she needs to continue that service." Over the following weeks, Sarah resumed her duties as a Marine pilot while maintaining constant awareness of potential threats. The protection teams promised by the intelligence services were invisible but effective, providing security without interfering with the normal operations of the base. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when surveillance teams detected unusual activity near the base perimeter. A team of foreign nationals had been conducting reconnaissance of security procedures and personnel movements, clearly preparing for some type of operation against the installation. Sarah was in the air conducting routine training exercises when the alert came through her secure communication system. The hostile forces had been identified and were being tracked by intelligence assets, but their specific intentions remained unclear. "Phantom 7, this is base control. You are cleared to continue your current exercise while we monitor developing situation on the ground." Sarah acknowledged the communication while her mind raced through the implications. After months of waiting and preparation, the trap they had set was finally being activated. The question now was whether their security measures would be sufficient to neutralize the threat without endangering innocent personnel. The resolution came swiftly and decisively. Intelligence teams moved in on the hostile surveillance team while Sarah was still airborne, capturing 3 foreign operatives who were found to be carrying detailed plans for an attack on the base's aviation facilities. Under interrogation, the captured operatives revealed that they had indeed been sent to eliminate the Marine pilot known as Phantom 7, confirming that Sarah's identity had been compromised exactly as intelligence analysts had predicted. But the operation had achieved its primary objective: the hostile network's attempt at revenge had been thwarted, and the captured operatives provided intelligence that led to the disruption of additional terrorist cells operating throughout Europe and North Africa. 3 days later, Sarah stood in Colonel Rodriguez's office once again, this time receiving news that would finally allow her to close the chapter on her double life. "The intelligence agencies have confirmed that the threat against you has been neutralized," he said, consulting the secure message he had just received. The network that was seeking revenge has been completely dismantled, and there are no remaining hostile forces with knowledge of your operational activities. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. Does this mean I can finally just be Captain Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps? That's exactly what it means. No more dual identities, no more intelligence operations, no more looking over your shoulder for threats that might emerge from your past. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve deception and danger. She could build relationships with her fellow Marines without worrying about maintaining operational security. She could contact her family without fear of compromising their safety. She could simply be herself, without reservation or pretense. There is one final matter to address, Colonel Rodriguez said, his tone becoming more formal. The intelligence services have recommended you for the Intelligence Star for your exceptional service during the operation that prevented the Desert Flower attacks. It's one of the highest honors available to intelligence operatives. Sarah was humbled by the recognition, but she realized that the greatest reward was simply the opportunity to continue serving her country in an open and honest capacity. Thank you, sir. But I think the real victory is that we prevented those attacks and saved lives. The recognition is secondary to the mission's success. Colonel Rodriguez smiled, recognizing the character that had made Sarah such an exceptional officer throughout her career. Spoken like a true Marine, Captain. Now, what do you say we get back to the business of running a military aviation unit? As Sarah left the colonel's office and walked across the base toward her quarters, she felt truly free for the first time in years. The sun was setting over Camp Lejeune, casting long shadows across the tarmac where helicopters sat ready for the next day's missions. She was no longer Phantom 7, the ghost operative who had supposedly died in an Afghan canyon. She was no longer the unnamed agent who had lived in the shadows, sacrificing her identity for the greater good. She was Captain Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps pilot, and that was exactly who she wanted to be. The journey had been longer and more difficult than she could have ever imagined when she first accepted her commission as a young officer fresh from flight school. She had lost and regained her identity multiple times, faced death and resurrection both literally and figuratively, and carried burdens that few people could understand. But, through it all, she had never lost sight of the core values that had drawn her to military service: honor, courage, and commitment. Those values had sustained her through the darkest moments and guided her through impossible decisions. Now, as she prepared for a future unburdened by secrets and deception, Sarah knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. She had served her country with distinction, protected innocent lives, and preserved the freedom that allowed others to live without fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new missions, but they would be faced by Captain Sarah Chen, operating under her real name with the full support of her fellow Marines. After years of living in the shadows, she was finally ready to step fully into the light. The young Marine who had first earned her wings so many years ago would hardly recognize the seasoned officer she had become. But, at her core, she remained the same person who had sworn an oath to defend her country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath had taken her places she never imagined and required sacrifices she never anticipated. But it had also given her purpose and meaning that transcended personal comfort or safety. As Sarah reached her quarters and prepared for another day of honest service, she knew that her story was far from over. There would be new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to serve. But, whatever the future held, she would face it as herself, without pretense or deception. The Phantom had finally come home.